Hi everyone, my name is Shaylee Harper, and in today's presentation I will be going over the various aspects surrounding the land claims policies within Canada. So a quick overview of what you can expect during this presentation. First, I will go over the definitions of specific and comprehensive land claims. Then I will go into detail about the problem definition, followed by my 3 policy recommendations. And then finally, we will finish by giving my recommendation of the 3 that were presented. So, there are 2 main types of land claims policies. First is comprehensive. This is used in situations where treaties or other legal pathways have not been properly addressed or solved. Comprehensive claims or modern treaties are meant to address this issue through negotiations between the Canadian government, the province or territory involved, and the Indigenous group involved. This is made possible through legislation and is supposedly the most effective way of handling these matters. Some comprehensive treaties are able to incorporate self-government, but this rarely happens, and when it does, it's achieved with great difficulty. Next, specific land claims occur when an Indigenous group files a claim against the Canadian government where the government has failed to meet agreed-upon obligations that were part of a treaty or other form of agreement. Specific claims are separate from comprehensive claims and are an attempt at resolving an outstanding specific claims through negotiations, resulting in a settlement ideal for both parties. Next is the problem definition. One specific policy that has always been a forefront concern for Indigenous groups is the recognition of Indigenous inherent right to the land. The current policy in place to address these concerns is the comprehensive and specific land claims process. The Crown's position on certainty prior to 1986 required Indigenous people to extinguish their already undefined rights, so many Indigenous people refused to do this. After 1986, the outcome of these events led the Canadian government to negotiate alternatives to the extinguishment of Indigenous rights that led to many treaties being completed. However, it is suggested that the government engaged in instrumental learning, which occurs when the tactics used to achieve the policy goals have changed, but the overall goal has not. So basically, the certainty provisions, which concludes that Indigenous groups formally agree not to exercise their inherent rights, have not changed at all by transforming Indigenous rights rather than getting rid of them altogether. Existing literature also states that formal agreements established through the comprehensive land claims process require an Indigenous group to formally acknowledge the government's authority over them through the group agreeing to cede, release, and surrender their Aboriginal title and rights. Many Indigenous groups that participate in the land claims process borrow the required funds from the Canadian government, and in some cases, the amount borrowed accumulates and exceeds the amount that they are meant to receive from the treaty settlement. As a result, many Indigenous groups stop their negotiating process altogether and choose not to engage in them again until an alternative is implemented. An audit from 2013 found that there is approximately $817 million, including $70 million in the process of being repaid, in outstanding loans for land claims agreements that are in progress or have been settled. Although the current policies in place have provided some control for Indigenous rights to land, many Indigenous people around Canada still feel as though their rights are not being fully acknowledged or met. There is literature that confirms that Indigenous traditions are not well understood or recognized within the aspect of Canadian politics or public policy, which contributes to the long process of reaching a settlement. Further, the land claims process has been disguised as advancing Indigenous inherent rights to land, but in practice has shown to keep the Canadian government best interest at the forefront. There are many land claims that have been brought to light since the implementation of the policies, and hardly any of them have concluded or made significant steps in settling them. There are multiple Indigenous nations that have implemented a land claims process but have not gone through with it because of expense or because it's a long process that does not have much payoff. An example of a current settlement that's going on is the Wet'suwet'en Nation settlement. The Wet'suwet'en Nation is located in northern British Columbia and is currently undergoing a land claims conflict regarding a coastal gas-linked pipeline crossing their territory. I was going to have a video, but I can't figure out how to make it work with the PowerPoint, but let's move on. My first policy option is creating provisions that require the Canadian government to be more transparent in all steps of the comprehensive and specific land claims process. This will ensure that the Canadian government is being held accountable for the effective performance of the process. If you cannot measure or assess something, you cannot improve the performance, which is needed in the land claims process. An intended consequence is that it would hold the government accountable for their actions within the process, which would involve them having the obligation of including appropriate Indigenous parties into the negotiation process. Potential unintended consequences would be that transparency and accountability of the government could lead to unrest with both the Indigenous and non-Indigenous community when something occurs that is not to the overall consensus. As of right now, the government is practicing transparency regarding the federal contracting activity within the process, but it is evident that transparency needs to be present at all steps during the policy process. My second recommendation is creating provisions that can help Indigenous groups obtain self-government rights. Although Canada recognizes the right to self-government as an Aboriginal inherent right under Section 35 of the Constitution Act, as of right now it is more of a policy rather than affirmed in law or even recognized by the Supreme Court of Canada. An unintended consequence could be that this affirmation of self-government could strip away other rights of Indigenous people in exchange for one, which has been done in the past. Now for my final recommendation, I think that it would be beneficial for both the government and Indigenous groups to create provisions and legislature guaranteeing the inclusion of relevant Indigenous parties in the land claims process, and it would ensure that history does not repeat itself. The intended consequences of the implementations of these provisions would be that all parties involved within the process are content with the outcome of the settlement, and it would lead to further reconciliation between the government and various Indigenous parties. In my opinion, this recommendation would not have any consequences due to the fact that the government has previously promised to comply with this notion, but having lawful provisions would ensure it and reaffirm it, and it would put a lot of minds at ease. For decades, the Canadian government has imposed laws on the Indigenous community, but working together will pose a more prosperous future of the relationship between the two. Okay, so now of the 3 land claim policy improvements that I have mentioned, the one that I recommend is making the Indigenous inherent right to self-government a law rather than a policy, and also easier to attain. In my opinion, this implementation would be the easiest and most ideal to go about because the Canadian government has already recognized this right under Section 35 of the Constitution Act, but it's just a matter of recognizing this right in law and by the Supreme Court of Canada. Okay, thank you for watching my presentation. Here are my references, and bye!